The letter from the county land office arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, and it said that Nellie Barrett's property lines were wrong, that she had been farming and grazing on land that did not legally belong to her, and that a neighboring rancher by the name of Gideon Collier intended to contest every inch of it. Nellie read the letter twice at the kitchen table, her coffee going cold beside her hand, the morning light cutting through the single window of the small house she had shared with her late husband Thomas for 6 years before the fever took him. She set the letter down on the oilcloth and looked out at the land she had worked alone for the past 14 months. The grass was coming in green after a wet winter. The creek that ran along the southern edge of her property was running high and clear. Her small herd of 20 cattle grazed in the lower pasture, and her kitchen garden was already showing the first shoots of the season. Everything she owned was tied to this land, and someone wanted to take a piece of it. She picked the letter up a third time and read it more carefully. The county assessor's office in Laramie, Wyoming, had received a formal claim from Gideon Collier of the Collier Ranch, alleging that the southern boundary of the Barrett homestead, as originally filed in 1876, encroached upon Collier land by approximately 40 acres. The letter requested that Mrs. Barrett present herself and any documentation she possessed within 30 days, or else the contested acreage would be forfeit by default. 40 acres. That was the lower pasture. That was the creek. That was most of the grazing land that kept her cattle alive through the dry months. Nellie Barrett was 31 years old. She had grown up in Ohio before coming west with Thomas, who had been a good man and a decent farmer but not a particularly organized one. When she went through his papers after his death, she found the original homestead filing, the deed from the General Land Office, and a hand-drawn map that Thomas had sketched himself when they first arrived, which she now suspected might not have been entirely accurate. What she did not find was any professional survey of the property. What she did find at the bottom of a cedar chest, under a folded wool blanket and a packet of letters from Thomas's mother, was a book. It was called Elements of Surveying and Navigation, written by a man named Charles Davies, and it had been published in 1835. The binding was cracked and the pages had browned at the edges, but the text was intact and the diagrams were clear. Thomas had never once mentioned owning this book. Nellie had no idea where he had gotten it. She sat on the edge of the bed that night, after she had put away his papers, and cried until she had nothing left, and she had read the first chapter. Then the second. Then she had fallen asleep with the book open on her chest. That had been 14 months ago. In the month since, when the ranch work allowed, she had been reading it. She had not, however, expected to actually need it. She stood up from the kitchen table, put the letter in the drawer where she kept important documents, and went to retrieve the book from the shelf beside the fireplace where she had kept it since moving it out of the cedar chest. She made fresh coffee. She sat back down. She opened the book to the chapter on measuring distances with a surveyor's chain and began to read with the focused attention of a woman who understood that her survival depended on what she could learn. The nearest town was Caldwell Creek, a small but established settlement 12 miles northwest of her property. It had a general store, a livery, a post office, a saloon called the Silver Horn, a small church, a school that operated 3 days a week, and a population of roughly 200 people including the surrounding ranch families. Nellie made the trip once a week in her wagon to collect mail and purchase supplies. She was known in town as a quiet, capable woman who had managed her grief without complaint and her land without asking for help. People respected her for it, even if some of the older men in town occasionally made noises about how it was a shame a woman was out there alone and whether she ought to consider selling. She had never considered selling. The day after she received the letter, she drove into Caldwell Creek and went to the general store, which was run by a man named Harold Ives, who stocked a reasonable assortment of tools and equipment. She asked him whether he had a surveyor's chain in stock. Harold looked at her over his reading glasses. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s with a gray beard and kind eyes. "A surveyor's chain," he said, as though confirming he had heard correctly. "A gunter's chain, if you have one." 66 feet, 100 links. Harold scratched his beard. "I might have something in the back that belonged to old Fenwick before he passed. Let me look." He came back 20 minutes later with a dusty chain coiled inside a wooden box. It was a proper gunter's chain, slightly tarnished but intact, with all 100 links accounted for. He also produced, at Nellie's request, a set of surveying stakes and a small compass that had belonged to the same Fenwick, who had apparently done some amateur land measuring before his death. "What do you need all this for?" Harold asked, not unkindly. "I need to survey my property," Nellie said, and she paid him what he asked without negotiating, which was unusual for her, and told Harold more about the urgency of the situation than her words did. She also stopped at the post office and spoke to the postmaster, a thin man named Irwin Boggs, who doubled as the informal recorder of local information. She asked him what he knew about Gideon Collier. Irwin Boggs leaned on the counter. "Collier's a big operation," he said. "Runs about 400 head up along the ridge. Moved here from Texas, about 4 years back. Bought the old Hendricks spread and expanded it considerably. He's a fair man by most accounts, but he doesn't like anything touching his borders. Had a dispute with the Vasquez brothers last year over a fence line." "Who won?" Nellie asked. "Collier did," Irwin said, "but the Vasquez brothers had a badly recorded deed. If your paperwork is in order, it might be different." Nellie thanked him and drove home, the chain rattling gently in the back of the wagon. She spent the next week teaching herself to survey her own land. The book was dense with mathematics, and she worked through each formula slowly and carefully at the kitchen table in the evenings, using an old slate board and chalk that had been left over from when Thomas had briefly tried to keep farm accounts more formally. She learned to use the compass to establish a baseline direction. She learned how to measure horizontal distances with the chain by accounting for slope. She learned about witness trees and bearing trees and how to re-establish corner monuments using recorded measurements. She learned about the principle of the transit, which she did not have, and she improvised a method of angle measurement using a protractor she found in Thomas's old schoolbook box and a plumb line she made herself from a fishing sinker and a length of cord. It was not elegant. It was not professional, but it was methodical, and Nellie Barrett was a methodical woman. She walked the southern boundary of her property 3 times in the first 4 days, once to establish the general lay of the land, once to measure it with the chain, and once to verify her measurements. She mapped it in a notebook, writing down every distance, every bearing, every landmark. The creek bottom, she found, made a very useful reference point, since it was a fixed natural feature that had been mentioned in the original land office filing. She located what appeared to be the original corner monuments, 2 of which were marked with iron pins that she found buried in the grass with careful probing, and one of which was a large, distinctive sandstone rock that the original surveyor's notes described precisely. What she found, when she compared her measurements to the original filing records she had obtained a copy of from the county assessor's office by mail, was that her lines were exactly where they were supposed to be. The original survey had been done in 1876 by a government surveyor named Josiah Webb, and his recorded measurements matched hers within a margin so small it could be accounted for by the difference between her improvised equipment and a professional transit. Her southern boundary, the one Collier was contesting, ran exactly where the 1876 documents said it did. She did not yet know what Collier's claim was based on, but she suspected she was about to find out. On the Thursday of the 2nd week after the letter arrived, she was working along the southern fence line in the late afternoon, double-checking the measurements of the creek bend, when she heard a horse coming across the rise. She straightened up from where she had been crouching over her notebook and put one hand at her brow to shield the sun. The man who rode toward her was somewhere in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered and lean in the way of men who did physical work every day of their lives. He was on a dark bay horse, a fine animal, and he rode with the easy confidence of someone who had been on horseback most of his life. He wore a plain work coat and a wide-brimmed hat, and there was nothing about him that announced wealth or authority, though Nellie suspected from the quality of his horse and his saddle that he had both. He reined in about 15 feet from her and looked at the chain laid out along the ground, at her notebook, at the stakes she had driven, and then at her. "Mrs. Barrett," he said. "Yes," she said, and she waited. He took off his hat, which surprised her a little. "My name is Gideon Collier. I own the land south of yours." "I know who you are," she said. "I got your letter." He held the hat between his hands. He had dark hair and gray eyes that were looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. It was not the arrogant look she had been preparing herself for. It was something more like uncertainty, which she had not anticipated. "I didn't come to make trouble," he said. "Your letter to the county assessor suggests otherwise," she said, keeping her voice level and professional. He glanced at the chain again. "What are you doing out here?" "I am surveying my property line," she said. "Since you've put the validity of it into question, I thought it wise to verify the measurements myself." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're surveying it yourself." "I am," she said. "Is there something about that which you find difficult to believe?" He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that had shifted into something she would have described, reluctantly, as impressed. "No," he said carefully. "I suppose not. I've just never seen a woman doing it." "I suspect there are a number of things I do that you've never seen a woman doing," she said, and she turned back to her notebook and wrote down the measurement she had just taken before she forgot it. She heard him dismount. His boots came through the grass, and he stopped a few feet away and looked at what she had written. He was close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, the faint smell of leather and horses and something like pine. "Can I look at your notes?" he asked. She considered refusing on principle, then decided that was not practical. She held the notebook out to him. He read through it with careful attention, turning pages slowly, going back to recheck things. He was quiet for a long time. The creek ran quietly to their right. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the grass behind them. "Where did you learn to do this?" he finally asked. "From a book," she said. He looked up from the notebook. "What book?" "Elements of Surveying and Navigation" by Charles Davies. He was quiet again. Then he said, "Your measurements are consistent with the 1876 filing." "Yes," she said, "I know. My foreman showed me a different set of measurements. He came across an older map, supposedly from before the homestead filing, that put the creek on the north side of what he marked as Collier land." Nellie looked at him steadily. "And you believed your foreman's map over the official county record?" Something moved across his face that she could not name. It was not quite embarrassment, but it was in that territory. "My foreman has been working land surveys in this territory for 20 years, he said. "And what is the source of this older map?" she asked. He was quiet. "Mr. Collier," she said, "is there a possibility that your foreman's map is not what he says it is?" He took a breath. He looked out at the flat horizon to the south where his land began. She could see, across the rise, the distant line of a fence, and beyond it a larger, more established operation than hers. He looked like a man who was working through something uncomfortable. "I don't know," he said. "I acted on his word. If his map is wrong, then I owe you an apology." "You owe me more than an apology," she said, not unkindly. "You've put me at risk of losing 40 acres that are legally mine, and I've spent 2 weeks teaching myself to survey in order to prove it." He met her eyes at that. "I understand," he said. "I'd like to see the original filing documents when you're ready to present them." "I'll be presenting them at the county assessor's office in Laramie in 2 weeks," she said. "You're welcome to be there with your foreman and his map." He nodded once. He handed her notebook back to her. He looked at the chain on the ground one more time, then at her. "Mrs. Barrett," he said, "for what it's worth, I think you've done a remarkable job." She took the notebook from him. "I did what was necessary," she said. He put his hat back on, walked back to his horse, and rode south across the rise. Nellie watched him go, then looked back at her notebook and tried to slow her heartbeat. which had picked up at some point during their conversation and had not entirely calmed down again. She told herself it was the confrontation. She told herself it was the tension of the situation. She told herself many sensible things as she walked back toward the house, carrying her chain and her stakes, and she believed most of them. Most of them. Over the following week, she continued her survey work, pushing herself to document every corner and every line of her property with the same precision she had applied to the southern boundary. The work was physically hard and mentally taxing. She was out in the field by sunrise and she worked until the light failed, then spent the evenings doing calculations at the kitchen table. She lost track of how many times she walked the same fence line, checking and rechecking. But by the end of the week, she had a survey document that was as thorough and carefully recorded as anything she could produce with the equipment she had. She also spent considerable time with the original 1876 filing documents, comparing every measurement and every bearing against her own findings. The match was as close as she had first determined. Josiah Webb, the original government surveyor, had done his job well, and Nellie Barrett had reproduced his work using a Gunter's chain, an improvised angle measuring device, and a textbook that was 47 years old. She was proud of it. She tried not to be too proud, because pride felt like a luxury in her current situation, but she was. On the Wednesday before the Laramie hearing, Gideon Collier came back. She was in the barn when she heard his horse, and she came out to find him tying the bay to the fence post near the gate. He was carrying something under his arm. He saw her and came across the yard without the hesitation of a man who was unwelcome. "I fired my foreman," he said by way of opening. She stopped walking. "You did?" His name was Carter Dale. He came to me 3 months ago with that map and told me it was a pre-settlement survey that had been overlooked when the homestead filings were made. He said it showed that the creek and the 40 acres south of it had always been Collier land by prior claim. Gideon's voice was even, but she could hear something underneath it. "I had a land agent in Laramie look at the map this week. He told me it was made within the last year. The ink, the paper, the style of drafting, nothing about it was consistent with a pre-1876 document." Nellie was very still. "Your foreman fabricated the map." "He did," Gideon said. "I don't know yet whether he did it on his own account or whether someone paid him to, but I intend to find out. And I've already withdrawn the claim from the county assessor's office." She exhaled slowly. The relief was physical, washing through her chest like warm water. She had been carrying the weight of the threat for 2 weeks, and she had not entirely realized how heavy it was until it lifted. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it fully. He looked at the item under his arm, which she now saw was a rolled paper, and he held it out to her. "I also had the land agent make a proper copy of your property description from the 1876 filing, with your measurements added alongside it. He said your survey work was exceptional. He wanted to know who you'd hired to do it." Gideon looked at her with those gray eyes, and there was something in them now that was warm in a way that she was not prepared for. "I told him you'd done it yourself." She took the rolled paper from him. Their fingers touched briefly in the transfer, and she became aware of the exact weight and temperature of his hand in a way that was entirely unreasonable given the circumstances. "What did he say to that?" she asked. The corner of Gideon's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was close. He said that was the most impressive thing he'd heard all month. She looked down at the rolled paper to give her face something to do that was not revealing. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked, because she was a woman who had been raised with manners even when the situation was complicated. He looked at her for a moment. "I would, yes," he said. They sat across the kitchen table from each other with the rolled paper between them and 2 cups of coffee, and she told him about the surveying book and how she had found it in the cedar chest. And he told her about coming to Wyoming from Texas 4 years ago after buying the Hendricks spread. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, the tension of the contested land lines dissolved into something else entirely. something that felt more like two people discovering that they were interested in each other in a way that neither of them had been expecting. She noticed that he had long hands, which she had no reason to be noticing. She noticed that he listened when she spoke with the particular quality of attention that meant he was actually hearing what she said rather than waiting for his turn to talk. She noticed that when he spoke about his ranch, his voice changed in a way that told her he loved it genuinely, not just as property, but as a living thing he was responsible for. He noticed, he would think later riding home, that she had ink on her fingers from writing calculations, and that her hair was coming loose from its braid, and that she spoke about surveying with the precision and confidence of someone who had earned her understanding the hard way and was not embarrassed about it. He stayed for an hour. When he stood to leave, he held his hat in his hands again, and she stood by the kitchen door, and there was a moment between them that neither of them named or acted on, but that both of them felt. "I'll write to the county assessor today confirming the withdrawal," he said. "I appreciate it," she said. He nodded. He went to his horse. He rode south. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him go, and this time she did not make any particular effort to explain to herself why her heart was doing what it was doing. The relief of having the claim withdrawn did not make Nellie less busy. If anything, it freed up the anxious energy she had been putting into the surveying and redirected it toward everything else on the property that needed doing. Spring on a working ranch in Wyoming in 1882 was not a season that permitted idleness. There were fences to mend from the winter damage, calves to tend, the kitchen garden to expand, and a corner of the barn roof that had begun to sag in a way that concerned her. She had a hand who came twice a week, a young Shoshone man named James Crow Wing, who had worked for Thomas before his death, and who had continued working for Nellie without either of them making a formal agreement about it. He was a hard worker and honest, and he knew the land around the Barrett property better than anyone alive, having grown up in the territory. The relationship between the settlers and the native people of the region was fraught in ways that Nellie was aware of and troubled by. The government's treatment of the Shoshone and the other tribes of the territory had been, by any honest accounting, unjust, and the confinement to reservations that had been occurring throughout the preceding decades had taken a heavy toll on people who had lived on this land long before any homestead filing or land office had existed. Nellie paid James Crow Wing fairly, which was not universal among the ranchers of the region, and she listened to him when he spoke, which was even less universal. It was James who told her, one morning while they were repairing the south fence, that Gideon Collier's former foreman Carter Dale had left the territory entirely. "Gone to Colorado, they say," James said, driving a new post with the methodical strength he brought to everything. "Took his horse and his saddle and was gone inside a week of being let go." "Do you know anything about him?" Nellie asked, holding the wire taut while James nailed it. "He came here about 6 months ago from somewhere east. Nobody knew him before. He talked a lot in the Silver Horn." James worked for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "There was a land speculator from Cheyenne who came through about that time, man named Harford. He had money and he wanted land near the creek." Nellie let the wire ease. She looked at James. "You think this Harford paid Dale to fabricate the map, so that Collier would take the 40 acres from me, and then Harford could buy them from Collier?" James shrugged in the particular way he had. That meant he was not speculating, but rather offering observed facts for her to interpret. "Harford came back through Caldwell Creek last month. He asked Harold Ives whether the Barrett place was for sale." Nellie felt cold for a moment in the warm spring air. She filed the information away in the same careful part of her mind where she had filed survey measurements, because information, she had learned, was its own kind of tool. That afternoon she wrote 2 letters. One was to the county assessor in Laramie, informing him of what she had learned about Carter Dale and the possible involvement of a speculator named Harford, on the grounds that it might be relevant to any future attempts to contest legitimate land claims in the area. The second was to Gideon Collier, because she thought he deserved to know what had possibly motivated his former foreman. The letter to Collier was harder to write than the one to the county assessor. She wrote it 3 times before she was satisfied. The first 2 versions were either too formal or, in the second attempt, too familiar, and she was not sure which of those errors disturbed her more. She settled on a version that told him what James had told her, clearly and without editorial comment, and signed it Nellie Barrett, which was the only version of her name that appeared on all her legal and business documents and was therefore appropriate. His reply came 4 days later, and it was not a letter. It was Gideon Collier himself, riding up to the house on a Saturday morning when she was hanging washing on the line. "I got your note," he said, dismounting and tying his horse with the ease of a man who had been doing that his whole life. "I gathered," she said, pulling a pillowcase from the basket and pinning it to the line. He came and stood near the line, not helping but watching. "I already knew about Harford," he said. "I had the same thought you did, and I'd asked some questions in town. I didn't write back because I was planning to come regardless." She paused with the next piece of washing in her hand. "Regardless of what?" He looked at her directly, with the gravity that she was beginning to understand was simply his way. He was not a man who played games with words. "Regardless of whether there was a specific reason, I wanted to see you again." The washing basket was between them. She looked at the damp linen in her hands and then at him, and she felt something shift in her chest like a door opening on a hinge that had been stiff for a long time. "Is that so?" she said, because she needed a moment to gather herself. "Yes," he said, and he had the particular stillness of a man who has said the honest thing and is waiting to see what it costs him. She pinned the linen to the line. She picked up another piece. She took a breath. "Then I suppose you might as well come in for breakfast," she said, "since you've ridden 12 miles for it." He came in for breakfast. They talked for 2 hours. He told her about Texas, about the ranch he had grown up on, about his father who had died in the war when Gideon was 14, leaving him and his older brother to work the place with their mother. He told her about his brother's death from a horse accident 8 years ago, and how after that he had sold the Texas ranch and come north, because everything in Texas reminded him of everything he had lost, and he needed new land to put his grief into. She told him about Ohio, about meeting Thomas at a county fair when she was 22, about following him west when he had the idea to homestead in Wyoming because the land was free and the sky was enormous. She told him about Thomas's death and the fever that had taken him in 3 days, faster than anything should be allowed to take a person. She told him about the first winter alone, which had been the hardest thing she had ever survived. She told him about the surveying book. "I think I started reading it because it was something I didn't know," she said. "After Thomas died, there was so much I had to figure out that I'd assumed he would always handle. Legal things, structural things. The kind of knowledge that society generally allows men to keep and doesn't bother teaching women, and I was furious about it, so I read the surveying book the way you'd have a fight with someone, out of anger." He looked at her with something in his eyes that was warmer than admiration and more serious than sympathy. "And then you found out you were good at it," he said. "I found out I could be good at it," she said. "With work, that's a different thing, that's better." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mother surveyed the back pasture of our Texas property herself when I was 12. Used 2 stakes and a rope and the shadow of a plumb line. She always said the land office surveyors were too expensive and she trusted herself more than she trusted a stranger with a transit." Nellie looked at him. "Did she get it right?" "Within a yard or 2, he said, "which was good enough." She smiled. It was not a small smile. It was the kind that arrived before you could decide whether to let it. He smiled back, and she understood then that she was in some measure of trouble, the pleasant kind. He came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and the one after that. The pattern established itself without either of them formally declaring that it was a pattern. the way that things between two careful people sometimes do. He always arrived in the morning on some pretext of practical purpose, a question about the fence line, a piece of information about the Harford situation, a tool he thought she might be able to use, and he always stayed longer than the pretext required. In late May, the county assessor's office sent a letter confirming that the contest of her property lines had been formally withdrawn, and that her survey records, including the measurements she had submitted alongside the original 1876 documentation, had been entered into the official county record. The letter noted, with the dry precision of a government document, that the quality and consistency of her measurements were in keeping with professional standards. She read this letter at the kitchen table and felt, for the first time in months, completely safe. She was still sitting with the letter when Gideon arrived that Saturday. She showed it to him because he had been involved in the situation, and it seemed natural, not because she needed his validation, but because she wanted to share the moment with someone who would understand what it had cost her. He read it. He set it down on the table. He looked at her. "Congratulations," he said, and his voice was low and warm in a way that did something to her breathing. "Thank you," she said, "for withdrawing the claim, for being honest about the map." "I should have checked the map more carefully before I ever filed anything," he said. "I was too quick to trust Dale because he was experienced. I should have verified his work the way you verified yours." "You made it right," she said. "That matters." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the May wind moved through the grass with a quiet sound like the turning of pages. "Mrs. Barrett," he said carefully, and then stopped. "Nellie," she said, because she had been wanting to say it for several weeks. "I think you've been here often enough to call me Nellie." Something happened in his expression. The careful formality that he had been maintaining like a fence between them shifted. "Nellie," he said, "I'd like to take you to dinner in Caldwell Creek, if you'd be willing." She considered him for one long, full moment, the way you consider a landscape before you decide to map it. "Yes," she said, "I would be willing." The dinner at the hotel dining room in Caldwell Creek on the first Friday of June was a significant event in the social life of a small town, in the way that two recently widowed or long single people of good standing going to dinner together always was in a small town. Nellie wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she had made herself 2 winters ago and which fit her well. She pinned her hair up more carefully than usual. She felt, getting ready, a complex mixture of anticipation and something that was not quite nervousness but was adjacent to it. Gideon was waiting for her in front of the hotel in a good coat, his hair combed, holding his hat in his hands in that way he had. When he saw her coming down the main street from where she had left her wagon at the livery, he walked out to meet her, and she thought, with the clarity that sometimes comes at significant moments, that he was a very fine-looking man. "You look wonderful," he said, and the simplicity of it, the directness, made it better than anything complicated would have been. "You look very presentable yourself," she said, which made him laugh. Dinner was 2 hours of conversation that covered everything from the nature of Wyoming winters to the ethics of land speculation to the question of whether women ought to have the vote, on which Nellie had strong opinions and Gideon, to his credit, listened to all of them and agreed with most of them. Wyoming had granted women the right to vote in 1869 as a territory, a fact that Nellie had known before moving there, and that had been part of her willingness to come. It was not nothing. It was something. It was not enough, but it was something. "My mother would have liked you," Gideon said over coffee, with the directness that she had come to understand was his truest quality. "I would have liked her," Nellie said. She surveyed with a plumb line. He reached across the table and with a deliberateness that she felt all the way to her spine, placed his hand over hers where it rested beside her coffee cup. She turned her hand palm up. He held it. They drove back to her property in her wagon, because his horse was tied to the back of it, side by side on the wagon seat with their arms barely touching, the Wyoming night enormous around them. The stars over the territory were extraordinary, more stars than the mind could properly process, a vast white river across the black. "I want to be honest with you," he said at some point on the drive, looking at the road ahead. "Please do," she said. "I came to dispute your land because I thought I was right," he said. "I came back because I knew I was wrong, and I've kept coming back since then because I cannot seem to want to stop." She was quiet for a while after that, listening to the steady sound of the horses. Then she said, "I have been reading the surveying book again." He looked at her. "There is a chapter on establishing true north," she said. "On finding where you actually are by measuring what you can verify." She felt him listening with his whole attention. "I think people do that too," she said. "Eventually, if they're honest." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "And where do you find yourself?" "Here," she said, and it was simple and it was true, and the stars were enormous overhead. He brought the wagon to a stop in front of her house, and the night was warm for June and full of the sound of crickets. He helped her down from the wagon with a hand that held hers firmly, not perfunctorily, and she stood on the ground looking up at him. "I'd like to do this again," he said. "So would I," she said. He squeezed her hand once and released it. He untied his horse from the back of the wagon. He looked at her one more time with those gray eyes that had learned to be warm. "Good night, Nellie," he said. "Good night, Gideon," she said, and she stood on the porch and listened to his horse until she could not hear it anymore, and then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while, not needing to do anything at all. The summer came in with a long, golden wave of heat and work. Nellie's cattle thrived in the summer pasture, and her kitchen garden produced abundantly, and she sold enough at the weekly market in Caldwell Creek to keep the ranch account comfortably above what it needed to be. She had always been careful with money, a quality that Thomas had appreciated and had not always shared. The ranch was not large, but it was hers, and it was solvent, and she was increasingly certain that it would remain so. Gideon continued to come on Saturdays, and she began going to his ranch on occasional Wednesdays, an arrangement they had fallen into so naturally that neither of them had consciously proposed it. The Collier Ranch was a larger operation, with a proper bunkhouse and 3 full-time hands, and a stone fireplace in the main house that Gideon had built himself the second winter after he arrived. He was proud of the fireplace in the specific way of a man who had done something with his hands and done it well, and she understood the pride entirely. She met his hands, 2 young men named Pete Aldridge and Sam Foss, who were respectful to her in the careful way of people who were watching to see what the situation was and had not yet decided what to make of it. And there was an older man named Hector Reyes, a vaquero from New Mexico, who had been with Gideon since Texas, and who watched Nellie with the assessing eyes of a man who had known Gideon long enough to be protective of him. Hector was the first one to show her genuine warmth, which came in the form of offering her a seat at the kitchen table with his own coffee cup, which was the highest compliment a working man of his generation knew how to give. "She is good," Hector told Gideon one evening after Nellie had gone home, which Gideon reported to her with a satisfaction he barely concealed. "High praise," she said. "From Hector, yes," he said. In July, Harold Ives told her in the general store that the man named Harford had come back through Caldwell Creek, asking questions about vacant land near the creek. Nellie sent another letter to the county assessor, and also to the territorial land office in Cheyenne, because a man who had potentially paid for a fabricated survey once was a man worth keeping an eye on. She mentioned Gideon's name in the letter as a corroborating source, which she had told him she intended to do. "Do you think they'll take it seriously?" Gideon asked when she told him. "They'll take it seriously enough to put it on record," she said. "Which means if Harford tries something similar with another property, there will be a pattern documented." He looked at her with something that was becoming familiar to her, a particular kind of attentive admiration that she was aware of in a way she had not been aware of anyone's attention since Thomas. "You think like a lawyer," he said. "I think like a woman who has had to document everything twice to make it count," she said. and he nodded with the seriousness of a man who was hearing that and understanding it properly. It was Hector who said to her one afternoon in late July, when she had come to help Gideon with the summer hay work and they had all been in the field together since early morning, "He talks about you all the time, you know." She was passing a water bucket. She stopped. "Does he?" Hector took a drink and handed the bucket back with the unhurried ease of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "Every day for 3 months," he said. "If you are wondering whether the man is serious, Mrs. Barrett, I can tell you that he is the most serious man I have ever known." She carried the water bucket back toward the wagon and looked out across the hay field where Gideon was working with Pete and Sam, a tall figure moving with the concentrated energy of someone who was genuinely happy doing what he was doing. She watched him for a long moment with the feeling in her chest that she had stopped trying to explain to herself. In August, during the summer fair in Caldwell Creek, which was a small but well-attended event featuring livestock judging, a pie contest, and a square dance in the evening, Gideon danced with her twice, which in the social mathematics of a small Wyoming town in 1882 was a declaration as legible as a formal announcement. Nellie was aware of the attention they were getting and found she minded it less than she might have expected. She had brought a gooseberry pie to the pie contest, which she had entered on impulse because Harold Ives had been enthusiastic about her gooseberries, and she won the blue ribbon for fruit pies, which delighted her more than she would have admitted. Gideon found out from Harold and told everyone in the immediate vicinity with a satisfaction that she found endearing. "You're making quite the production of this," she told him, and he said without any self-consciousness, "I think you deserve it," and she had to look away. They were standing at the edge of the dance floor between dances, with the music going on around them and the lanterns strung above the square turning everything golden, and she could feel the warmth of him standing beside her. She thought about the letter she had received in the spring, and the 2 weeks of surveying in the field alone, and the first time he had ridden across the rise and looked at her chain laid out on the grass. She thought about how much had happened and how much had changed. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. "Gideon," she said. "Yes," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that told her he already knew what she was about to say, or at least knew the territory of it. "I think you should know," she said, carefully and honestly, "that I am not looking for someone to manage my affairs or to take over my property or to fix things that do not need to be fixed." "I know," he said. "I am looking for someone to stand beside," she said. "Not in front of, beside." "I know," he said again, and the way he said it told her he had been knowing it for some time and was simply glad she had said it aloud. "All right, then," she said. He took her hand. There at the edge of the dance floor with the music and the lanterns and the whole of Caldwell Creek potentially watching, and he held it with the straightforward certainty of a man who had found true north. September arrived with the first cool nights, and the quality of the light changed the way it did in Wyoming when summer began to recede, going long and golden and slow across the grass. Nellie was cutting the last of her kitchen garden when Gideon rode up on the bay horse and tied him to the fence, and came through the gate with a purpose in his walk that was slightly different from his usual arriving manner. She straightened up from the garden with a bunch of late carrots in her hand and looked at him. He stopped in front of her. He took his hat off. He held it in both hands. He looked at her with the gray eyes that she had come to know as well as she knew the compass directions of her own land. "I want to marry you," he said, "if you're willing." She looked at the carrots in her hand. She looked at him. She thought about Thomas, who had loved her and been a good husband, and whose death had left her alone in a way that had changed her more than she knew until afterward. She thought about the surveying book. She thought about measuring the distance from where she was to where she wanted to be. "I want a formal agreement," she said, and she saw him blink. "Of course," he said. "My land stays mine," she said. "It stays in my name. I'll run my ranch. You'll run yours. We'll be partners in everything the word means." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said, and she believed him. "And you understand," she said, that I will continue to do exactly as I see fit with my own property, including surveying it myself when the occasion requires." The corner of his mouth moved in the way she had loved since the first time she saw it. "I was counting on it," he said. She set the carrots down on top of the bean plants. She looked at him. She took a step toward him, and he closed the remaining distance, and when she put her hand against his chest, she could feel his heart beating with a speed that matched her own. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He put his arms around her for the first time, both of them, carefully and then fully, and she let herself lean into the solid warmth of him with the feeling of something that had been held at tension for a very long time finally releasing. They were married in October, in the small church in Caldwell Creek, on a day when the cottonwoods along the creek had turned entirely gold and the air was sharp and bright. Nellie wore a dress of cream-colored wool that she had made herself, with her hair down for the first time in years, which made Harold Ives's wife say she looked like a painting. James Crow Wing came, sitting in the back of the church with the quiet dignity he brought to everything. Hector Reyes sat in the second pew and cried without apparent embarrassment. Pete Aldridge and Sam Foss sat beside him and kept each other company in their awkwardness. Half of Caldwell Creek came, because it was the kind of event that a small town takes to heart. Irwin Boggs gave a short and well-intentioned speech about the merits of both parties before anyone asked him to, and Harold Ives provided a remarkable array of food at the small reception in the church hall afterward, from his wife's kitchen and from Nellie's own stores, the gooseberry preserves she had put up in summer, a joint effort that seemed to her exactly like what the day required. The minister, a young man named Reverend Asher Price, who had been in Caldwell Creek for less than a year and who took his work seriously, conducted the ceremony with warmth and precision. When he pronounced them married, Gideon Collier looked at Nellie Barrett with the expression of a man who could not quite believe his own good fortune, and she looked back at him with the expression of a woman who had measured her lines twice and knew exactly where she stood. He kissed her with the same directness he brought to everything, and Hector Reyes began clapping before anyone else did, which started everyone else. They went back to Nellie's house for their first night together because she had asked to, and he understood. She had wanted to be in her own home, the house she had built her life in, for the beginning of this new part of it. The house was small but warm, with the fireplace lit and the cottonwood smell of October coming through the window she had left open an inch. She had put the surveying book on the shelf beside the bed, because it had been there for 14 months and moving it felt wrong. He noticed it when they came in, and he took it down and looked at the spine. "Can I read it?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and she laughed a little at the asking of it, and he laughed too, and the laughter in the small warm house was one of the most beautiful sounds she had ever heard. They built their life with the same care that Nellie had built her survey. They did not merge their ranches immediately, keeping them as formally separate operations as she had specified. But the practical reality was that 2 ranches 12 miles apart with the same 2 operators required coordination, and coordination required communication, and communication required spending time together, which neither of them found burdensome. Gideon began spending more time at the Barrett Ranch during the week, which naturally led to conversations about the efficiency of making the travel shorter, which naturally led to the construction, in the spring of 1883, of a proper bedroom addition to Nellie's house that would serve as their shared home base. He built it himself with Hector's help and Pete's grudging but competent assistance, and it was a good room, with a wide window that looked south toward the creek and the lower pasture. James Crow Wing came every day now, rather than twice a week, and took over management of the Barrett cattle with a thoroughness that freed Nellie to spend more time on the work she had discovered she was genuinely good at. The surveying had not stopped at her own boundary lines. By the autumn of 1883, Nellie Barrett Collier had, through a combination of her own reputation from the county assessor's hearing and word of mouth in the small and interconnected community of Wyoming ranchers, been asked to survey 2 neighboring properties by owners who could not afford professional survey fees. She charged modestly, enough to cover her time and her supplies, and she did the work with the same methodical thoroughness she had brought to her own lines. She had also, by then, acquired a proper transit through a combination of savings and a purchase made at an estate auction in Laramie, which improved her precision significantly and made the work considerably faster. Gideon watched this with the specific pleasure of a man watching someone he loves doing the thing they are best at. He carried stakes for her when he came along. He learned to hold the chain properly, which required patience because the correct method was, as Nellie pointed out firmly, not the intuitive method. He became competent at it, which she told him was a significant achievement, and he accepted the praise with the gravity with which he accepted everything. In the late spring of 1883, Nellie discovered she was expecting a child. She told Gideon on a morning when the prairie outside was running green and the creek was high and the meadowlarks were everywhere. She told him at breakfast matter-of-factly because she was matter-of-fact about most things, and then she watched his face do the most unguarded thing she had ever seen it do. He got up from the table without saying anything and came to her and held her carefully, as though she were both very strong and very precious, which she supposed was accurate. She put her arms around him and felt him breathe. "Are you well?" he asked into her hair. "Perfectly well," she said. "I want to keep working until I can't." "I wouldn't expect anything different," he said, and then after a moment, "I'm so glad." "So am I," she said. The summer of 1883 was warm and productive. The Harford situation had resolved itself definitively when the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne had investigated the speculators' activities and found a pattern of problematic claims involving fabricated or altered survey documents in 3 different counties. Harford had been prosecuted for land fraud in the fall, a proceeding that Nellie followed with considerable interest in the territorial newspapers. Carter Dale had never reappeared in Wyoming, and a sheriff's inquiry had determined that his connection to Harford was confirmed by several witnesses in Cheyenne, who had seen the 2 men together multiple times in the months before Dale had presented the false map to Gideon. It was, as far as Nellie was concerned, a complete resolution, both legally and morally. The people who had tried to take her land had been held accountable. Her lines had stood. Her work had been enough. In November, 2 weeks before the first real snow of the season, Nellie gave birth to a son. He was a healthy baby with his father's gray eyes and his mother's determined expression, which was apparent even in the first hours of his life, and which made Hector Reyes, who had come with Gideon and been told to wait on the porch, and had stood there for 3 hours refusing to leave, say upon being allowed in that the boy looked like he already knew his own mind. They named him Thomas Gideon Collier, Thomas for Nellie's first husband, which Gideon had proposed himself and which she had accepted with the full understanding of what the gesture meant, and Gideon for his father, which seemed right and necessary. Reverend Price baptized young Thomas at the church in Caldwell Creek in December, with Hector standing as godfather and Harold, Ives's wife, standing as godmother, a combination that seemed to Nellie to represent the community that had come to mean home. James Crow Wing came to the baptism and stood in the back as usual, and Nellie caught his eye across the church and nodded to him, and he nodded back in the way that passed between them for an expression of everything important. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was severe, the kind of Wyoming winter that tested everything: the land, the animals, the structures, and the people. Nellie and Gideon worked through it with the combined resources of 2 ranches, which made it considerably more manageable than any previous winter had been for either of them. Gideon had more hay stores. Nellie had a better-sited barn. Together they lost none of their combined herd, which was a remarkable outcome for the season. Young Thomas was a calm and interested baby who seemed to take the constant activity of a working ranch as entirely natural, which Nellie attributed to some quality of his character rather than anything she was doing, since she had no particular expertise in babies and was proceeding largely on practical instinct. In the spring of 1884, when the thaw came and the creek ran high again and the grass came back green, Nellie walked her southern boundary one more time. She did it alone, on a still morning when Gideon was at the north pasture with Hector and Thomas was with Gideon's sister Margaret, who had come from Texas to meet her nephew, and who had stayed for a month because she found Wyoming remarkable. Nellie walked the line from the eastern corner stake to the western, slowly, with no chain and no compass, just herself and the land she had measured and documented and defended. The iron pin at the southeast corner was right where she had marked it. The sandstone rock at the southwest corner was right where it had always been, right where Josiah Webb had noted it in 1876, solid and indifferent and permanent. She stood at the southwest corner with the creek running to her right and the lower pasture opening before her, the 40 acres she had fought to keep, and she put her hand on top of the sandstone rock. The stone was cold from the morning, but the sun was on it now. It would warm by noon. She thought about the letter that had arrived on the Tuesday morning 2 years before. She thought about the surveying book. She thought about Gideon riding across the rise toward her with his hat in his hands, looking at her chain on the ground, with an expression she had not known how to read yet. She thought about the distance from that morning to this one. She turned around and walked back to the house, where her husband was coming up from the north pasture on his bay horse, and her son was somewhere inside making the particular noise he made when he wanted attention. And where the kitchen fire was still burning from the morning, and the surveying book was on the shelf in the bedroom beside a good transit and 2 new field notebooks, and the official copy of the property survey that the county assessor's office had made from her measurements and entered into the permanent record. She was home. She was exactly where her lines said she was. Gideon came through the gate and dismounted and looked at her across the yard with the particular expression he saved for moments when she had done something that he found both entirely characteristic and entirely astonishing. She had told him where she had been. He had known without her telling him. "How are the lines?" he called. "Perfect," she said, and she was smiling in a way she could not help. He walked toward her with his hat in his hand. "They always were," he said, and the warmth in it was so complete and certain that it required no response except the one she gave him, which was to walk toward him too. The spring and summer of 1884 brought a new kind of fullness to their lives. Thomas learned to crawl with a speed and determination that required constant supervision, and the combined resources of 2 adults and an extended community of friends meant that the work of the ranch did not collapse under the additional demands of a mobile baby, but it was close sometimes. Gideon had a particular method of carrying Thomas in one arm while doing almost anything else with the other, which Hector found hilarious, and which Thomas seemed to prefer to any other arrangement. Margaret Collier, Gideon's sister, extended her stay through the summer and proved herself a capable ranch hand, who had clearly grown up in the same working household as her brother. She was 33, unmarried, and had a quality of directness and humor that Nellie found immediately compatible with her own nature. The 2 women developed a friendship in those months that had the ease of people who recognized each other on a fundamental level. Margaret was the one who noticed in July that Nellie was expecting again. "You have the same look my mother had both times," Margaret said one morning over breakfast, with the calm certainty of someone who was simply observing a fact. Nellie looked at her. "I had wondered," she said, "does Gideon know?" "Not yet. He'll be insufferably happy," Margaret said with great affection. He was, in fact, insufferably happy. He expressed it in his usual way, which was to become even quieter and steadier than usual, and to appear wherever Nellie was more frequently than strictly necessary, which she had noticed was his response to things that moved him deeply. She let him. She found she did not mind being near him, which she supposed was how you could tell when things were going well. She continued her survey work through the summer and early fall, finishing 2 more property surveys for neighboring ranchers, and receiving an inquiry from the county assessor's office in Laramie, who had heard about her work through the official record and wanted to know whether she would be available for consulting work on boundary disputes. The letter was addressed to N. Collier, surveyor, which she looked at for a long time before she replied. She replied that she would be available on a selective basis, that her fees were $40 per survey plus expenses, and that her equipment and methodology were consistent with professional standards as verified by the county's own records. County assessor, a man named Whitmore who Nellie had never met, wrote back within 2 weeks to say that those terms were acceptable and that he had 3 disputes currently pending that he would like to refer to her. Gideon read this letter over her shoulder at the kitchen table and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "You should charge 50. 40 is fair," she said. "You're worth 50, he said. "I'll charge 40 now and 50 once I've done 6 official jobs," she said. "Build the record first." He made a sound of acceptance that contained, she knew by now, a considerable amount of admiring frustration. "All right," he said. 40. In February of 1885, their second child arrived. This one was a boy too, which surprised them both, though she had had a feeling. He came into the world with great enthusiasm and very little patience, which they recognized as a character trait early and planned around accordingly. They named him Samuel Hector Collier, Samuel for no particular reason except that it suited him, and Hector for the man who was sitting on the porch again and who wept openly and unashamedly when told the middle name. Thomas, who was 14 months old, regarded his new brother with the philosophical calm of a child who has decided to accept the world as it presents itself. He investigated Samuel's face with one careful finger and then went back to whatever he had been doing before, which Nellie felt was an entirely reasonable response. By the spring of 1885, the Barrett-Collier operation, which they had never formally named but which people in Caldwell Creek had taken to calling simply that, was one of the more stable and productive ranches in the county. Nellie's official survey consulting work had expanded to 4 counties, and she had 6 official surveys in the permanent record, which meant she had raised her fee to $50 as promised. She had also, at James Crow Wing's suggestion, and with Gideon's full support, helped survey and document a section of land that a small group of Shoshone families had been farming along the river for years without formal title, connecting them with the legal resources in Cheyenne to file for proper documentation. It was a small thing against a very large injustice, as she knew, but it was something, and something was not nothing. James Crow Wing, who came every day and managed the Barrett cattle with complete authority, was also teaching Thomas, who at 18 months was already spending significant time outdoors, the names of the plants and birds around the property. Gideon had watched this for several weeks before asking Nellie whether she thought it was appropriate, not in a dismissive way but in the genuine way of a man trying to understand, and she had told him it was the most appropriate and valuable thing that could happen for their son, and that he should sit down and learn alongside him, and he had. The summer of 1885 was long and good. The ranches were healthy. The cattle were fat on summer grass. Nellie's official survey work continued to build a reputation that was beginning to extend beyond the immediate county, and she had received one inquiry from a railroad company regarding boundary surveys along a proposed spur line, which she declined on the grounds that it was too far from home, and she had 2 children under 2 years old. But she filed the inquiry away as evidence of what the future might hold. Gideon continued to be, in all the ways that mattered, exactly what he had shown her he was from the moment he had taken off his hat in the south pasture and looked at her surveying chain with those gray eyes. He was honest and steady and capable, and he loved her in the particular, attentive, serious way of a man who understood what he had and did not take any of it for granted. He made her laugh, which she had not expected to find essential in a partner, but turned out to be among the most important things. He made her feel not smaller, not managed, not protected from herself, but accompanied, which was the exact word for what she had wanted when she had told him she was looking for someone to stand beside her. On the second anniversary of their wedding in October of 1885, Gideon gave her a new surveying transit, a good German-made instrument in a fitted mahogany case with her initials engraved on the brass plate. She opened the case at the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. "That's extravagant," she said. "Yes," he said, entirely unrepentant. She ran her fingers along the brass of the instrument. "It's beautiful," she said. "So is the work you do with it," he said. And he said it simply and without sentimentality, and she believed every word. Young Thomas, sitting on the floor with Samuel and an arrangement of wooden blocks, looked up and said something that was not yet a recognizable word, but had the confident cadence of an observation. Both his parents looked at him. He looked back at them with gray eyes, his father's eyes, and an expression of determined engagement that was entirely his mother's, and returned to his blocks. Outside the window, the cottonwoods along the creek were gold again, the October gold that she had come to love as her own particular season, the season in which she had married, the season in which everything had changed. The creek ran on, south of the lower pasture where the iron pin sat in the ground, and the sandstone rock sat in the sunlight, right where they had always been. Nellie Barrett Collier looked at her husband across the kitchen table, over the open case of the surveying instrument, with the sounds of her children around her, and the smell of the autumn coming through the window she had left open an inch, and she felt the particular completeness of a life that had been measured carefully and found to be exactly what it should be. Her lines were perfect. They had always been perfect. She had simply needed to prove it, and in proving it she had found everything. In the years that followed, when neighbors asked Nellie how she had come to be a surveyor, she would tell the story simply and honestly. She would tell them about the letter from the county land office, and the chain she bought from Harold Ives, and the book she had found in the cedar chest. She would tell them about walking the south fence line 3 times in the first 4 days. She would tell them about the man who had ridden across the rise toward her with uncertainty in his eyes and ended up staying. She told the story without embellishment, because the facts of it were sufficient. A widow with a book and a chain, and a determination not to lose what was hers, had surveyed her own land and found the lines true. The rest had followed from that, as consequences follow from honest measurements, as the territory follows from the map, as the life follows from the work put into it. In 1886, Nellie was formally recognized by the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne as a certified survey consultant, one of the first women in Wyoming Territory to hold such a designation. The letter announcing this was addressed to Mrs. Nellie Collier, surveyor, and she kept it in the same drawer where she had kept the original contested boundary letter from the county assessor's office 4 years before. She kept them together, the threat and the recognition, because together they told the true story. Gideon framed them both and hung them in the addition he had built, the room with the wide south-facing window, and she let him, because he was right that some things deserved to be on the wall. Thomas Gideon Collier and Samuel Hector Collier grew up on the combined Barrett-Collier ranch, with a mother who could tell you the bearing and distance to any point on the property, and a father who could build anything from stone. They grew up knowing the names of plants from James Crow Wing, and knowing the cattle from Hector Rays, and knowing the value of honest work and carefully measured lines. They grew up watching their parents stand beside each other, and that, more than anything, was what they learned. On a spring morning in 1887, Nellie walked the south boundary one last time with Thomas, who was 3 years old and serious about everything, and had asked to come. She let him carry one end of the Gunter's chain. He held it in both hands with the gravity of someone who understood, even at 3, that he was participating in something important. She held the other end. They walked from the eastern corner stake to the sandstone rock, 50 chains exactly, and at the western corner she stopped and looked south toward the Collier land and the long grass running to the ridge. Thomas stood beside her with the chain in his hands and looked where she looked. "Mama," he said. "Yes," she said. "This is ours?" he asked, meaning the land, the pasture, the creek. "Yes," she said. "How do you know?" he asked, because he was 3 years old and this was the age of questions. She looked at the sandstone rock. She looked at the iron pin she had driven herself into the ground at the far end. She looked at the creek running clear in the early light and the meadowlarks over the pasture and the sky so blue over Wyoming that it seemed impossible that anything as ordinary as trouble had ever moved through it. "Because I measured it," she said. "I measured it myself, and the lines are true." Thomas considered this with 3-year-old thoroughness. Then he nodded and began walking back toward the house, carrying his end of the chain with perfect seriousness, and she followed him, holding her end, both of them walking the true line home. Gideon was at the fence near the gate, watching them come across the pasture, and when they got close he leaned on the fence post and looked at them with the gray-eyed warmth that she had come to understand was the most honest thing she had ever been given. He opened the gate. She and Thomas walked through. "Perfect," he said, looking at her. "Perfect," she agreed. And the morning opened around them, wide and gold and entirely their own.